The alarm in my chest was not the kind that came from a machine. It came from somewhere older, somewhere I had carried with me since the day I stepped off the transport ship and onto the metal floor of the Virith Combat Academy. My name is Emma Carter, and I was the only human in a room full of beings who did not think I belonged there. The academy sat on a ring station above a blue gas giant, spinning slowly enough that gravity felt almost natural. Almost. My boots were heavier here, built with extra grip because human balance was considered a liability by the engineers who designed the training halls. I noticed that detail on my first day, and I never stopped noticing it. Every small thing here reminded me that I was the newest species in a galaxy full of old ones, and old ones do not always make room for the new. The Academy had opened its doors to humanity only 8 months earlier, after the peace agreements following the Kesrin conflict. Our diplomats had fought hard for that seat. Our soldiers had fought harder for the respect that came with it. I was part of the first group of human cadets allowed into a mixed classroom with cadets from a dozen other worlds. There were 4 of us in the entire building. I was the only one in this particular class. I walked into the combat theory hall that morning, already tired. Not from lack of sleep, though I had not slept much, but from the constant weight of being watched. Every step I took was studied. Every word I said was measured against some invisible scale that decided whether humans deserved to be here at all. The room was shaped like a bowl, with seats rising in circles around a lowered floor where demonstrations happened. I took my seat near the back, close to the exit, an old habit from years of training that told me to always know where the door was. Around me sat cadets built like small mountains, cadets with skin like polished stone, cadets with 4 arms folded neatly across broad chests. I was, by a wide margin, the smallest person in the room. Instructor Dolrek Vantis entered a few minutes later, and the room went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when everyone respects, or fears, the person walking in. He was Thranari, a species built for war the way sharks are built for water. 4 arms, thick gray skin, a face carved with old scars that he wore like medals. He had fought in 3 major campaigns before becoming an instructor, and every cadet in that room had studied his record before ever meeting him in person. He did not look at me right away. He looked at all of us, one slow sweep of the room, the kind of look that measured worth without asking permission. Then he began his lecture, and his voice filled the hall without needing any amplification. "Today," he said, "we discuss species durability. This is not opinion, this is data. When you understand what a body can survive, you understand how to fight beside it, and how to fight against it." He brought up a chart on the display behind him, a long list of species ranked from most resilient to least. Thranari sat near the top, alongside a few others I did not recognize. I scanned the list quickly, already knowing where I would find my own kind, because I had seen similar charts before, in briefings back on Earth, in reports written by people who had never actually watched a human refuse to stop moving after everything told them they should. There it was, at the very bottom, humans, below insects that could survive vacuum for short bursts, below organisms that could regenerate limbs, below nearly everyone in that room. A few cadets chuckled, not loudly, not cruelly, at least not at first. Just the quiet amusement of people who had never questioned a chart before. Instructor Vantis tapped the screen, and my species designation grew larger, highlighted in a soft red that felt like it had been chosen specifically to look like a warning label. "Humans," he said, "are soft. Thin skin, slow healing, no natural armor, no claws, no venom, no enhanced senses. They break easily, and they break often. I have read the reports from the Kesrin conflict. Impressive tactics, I will admit, but tactics built around fragility, not strength." More laughter this time, a little louder. I kept my eyes forward, my hands resting flat on the desk in front of me, my breathing steady the way I had trained it to be steady, even when everything inside me wanted to react. I had heard worse. I had heard this exact kind of thing from officers back home who doubted whether soldiers half my size could carry the same weight as someone twice their build. I had proven those people wrong more than once. I told myself I would not need to prove anything here. I told myself this was just a lecture, just words, and words could not actually hurt me. Vantis continued, warming to his subject the way a teacher does when he believes he is finally reaching his students. He talked about bone density, about the number of vital points on a human body compared to other species, about how a single well-placed strike could end a fight that a Threnari or an Ossen cadet could walk away from without even needing medical attention. He was not entirely wrong. I knew the numbers too. I had studied them long before he had ever met a human in person. What bothered me was not the facts. It was the tone. It was the way he said fragile, the same way someone might say useless. It was the small curl at the corner of his mouth every time the class laughed, like he was collecting their laughter as proof of something he already believed. A cadet near the front, a large Ossen with thick-plated shoulders, raised one of his upper arms and asked a question that was really just an excuse to laugh harder. He asked if it was true that humans could be injured simply by falling from a standing position. Vantis said yes, in certain cases, depending on the surface. The room erupted again, and this time I felt heat rise in my face, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to controlled anger, the kind I had learned to hold on to rather than release. I thought about my grandmother, who had survived things that would have ended most people twice her size, simply because she refused to accept that she was finished. I thought about my father, who came home from 3 deployments with pieces of himself changed forever, but who still stood taller than anyone I had ever known. I thought about every mission report I had read where soldiers my size and shape had done things that should not have been possible according to any chart, like the one glowing red behind Vantis. Fragile was not the word I would have chosen. Adaptable felt closer to the truth. So did stubborn. Vantis finally turned his attention to me, and the room's laughter faded into an expectant hush, the kind of silence that comes right before someone is about to be made an example of. "Cadet Carter," he said, my voice carrying easily to where I sat. "Perhaps you disagree with the data." I did not answer immediately. I had learned a long time ago that silence could be its own kind of strength, that rushing to defend yourself sometimes gave more power to the person trying to provoke you. I let a few seconds pass before I spoke. "The data is accurate," I said. My voice was calm, even, giving nothing away. Humans do not have thick skin or natural weapons. That part is true. A few cadets exchanged glances, clearly expecting me to argue and confused when I did not. "But durability is not only about what a body can survive," I added. "It is also about what a mind refuses to accept as the end." For a moment, the room was quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that comes when someone says something unexpected. Vantis studied me with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between curiosity and challenge. "Poetic," he said finally, and the amusement returned to his voice. "But poetry does not stop a strike from breaking bone." He turned back to the class, and the lecture continued, moving on to other species, other statistics, other comparisons. I sat there, jaw tight, hands still flat on the desk, and I told myself the same thing I had told myself 100 times before in rooms just like this one. Let them underestimate you. It has always worked in your favor before. Near the end of the session, Vantis announced that the following class would include a practical demonstration. He wanted to show, in person, exactly how a human body reacted under controlled combat pressure, so that cadets from other species would understand the risks of engaging a human opponent without proper caution. He looked directly at me when he said it. "Cadet Carter will assist," he said. It seemed less like a request, and more like a decision that had already been made the moment he saw me sitting in that back row. I felt every set of eyes in the room shift toward me at once. Some curious, some amused, a few, I noticed, almost sympathetic, as if they already believed they knew how this demonstration would end. I nodded once, keeping my expression unreadable, though my mind was already working through possibilities, already replaying years of training, already remembering every lesson my instructors back on Earth had drilled into me about controlling a situation before it controlled you. Class ended a few minutes later. Cadets filed out around me, some glancing my way, a few of them offering quiet, almost gentle comments about how I should not worry too much, that Vantis went easy on new cadets during demonstrations. I said nothing in response, only offered a small, polite nod that gave nothing away. I stayed in my seat a little longer than the others, staring at the empty display where the chart had been, where my species had sat labeled as the weakest in the room. I thought about all the times people had looked at me and assumed the outcome of a fight before it had even begun. I thought about every instructor, every opponent, every skeptical officer who had learned, eventually, that assumptions were the most dangerous weapon in any fight, because they blinded the person holding them. Vantis believed he understood humans through numbers on a screen. He believed fragility was a fact carved in permanent stone. He was preparing to stand in front of an entire class and prove that belief using me as his example. I gathered my things and stood, feeling the quiet hum of the station beneath my feet, the same hum I had felt every day since arriving. Tomorrow, in front of every cadet who had laughed today, Instructor Vantis intended to demonstrate exactly how easily a human could break. I intended to demonstrate something else entirely. As I walked out of the hall and into the corridor, my reflection caught briefly in a polished metal panel along the wall. I looked steady, controlled, nothing like the fragile creature described on that chart. I had spent my whole life proving people wrong about what my body could endure. Tomorrow would simply be one more day added to that record. I just did not yet know how far it would go. The next morning, the combat theory hall was fuller than usual. Word had spread overnight, the way it always does in a place where everyone lives close together and gossip travels faster than official announcements. I noticed extra cadets from other sections standing along the back wall, clearly there only to watch the demonstration, not to attend the actual lecture. Some of them whispered when I walked in. I kept my eyes forward and my pace steady. I had not slept much, not because I was afraid, but because I had spent most of the night running through scenarios in my head, the same way I had done before every real engagement I had ever faced. I thought about my training, about the years spent learning that strength was not always about size, that leverage and timing could turn a smaller frame into an advantage rather than a weakness. I thought about my instructors back on Earth, people who had drilled into me that fear was only useful if you let it control your hands. I did not plan to let it control anything today. Instructor Vantis arrived a few minutes after the rest of us, walking with the same confident stride he always used, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who had never once doubted his own conclusions. He carried himself like a person who already knew how the next hour would unfold, and in his mind, I imagine he did know. He believed this would be simple, a quick demonstration, a predictable outcome, a lesson reinforced for an audience eager to see it confirmed. He stepped down into the lowered floor at the center of the room and gestured for me to join him. I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of every eye in the hall settle on me at once. I walked down the few steps calmly, my boots silent against the metal floor, my breathing slow and controlled, the way I had trained myself to breathe before any confrontation, whether it was a sparring match or something far more serious. Cadet Carter will demonstrate the limitations of human physiology, Vantis announced to the room, his voice carrying easily to every seat. I want each of you to understand exactly what you are dealing with should you ever find yourselves paired with a human in the field. This is not an insult, it is information. Information saves lives. A few cadets nodded, taking the moment seriously despite the earlier laughter. Others still wore faint smiles, clearly expecting this to be more entertainment than education. I said nothing, simply stood a few feet from him, my hands loose at my sides, my stance relaxed but ready, the kind of readiness that does not look like readiness to someone who does not know what to look for. Vantis began explaining the human skeletal structure to the class, using me as a visual reference while he spoke. He gestured toward my shoulder, my wrist, my collarbone, listing each area as a point of weakness, compared to the reinforced joints and layered muscle structures common among most species in the room. I stood still, letting him talk, letting the class listen, giving away nothing about what I already understood, far better than any chart could teach. He stepped closer and reached for my wrist, intending to demonstrate a basic restraint hold, the kind used to control a resisting opponent without causing serious harm. It was meant to be gentle, at least by his standards, a simple grip meant to show the class how easily a human joint could be controlled with minimal effort. The moment his fingers closed around my wrist, I felt the calculation kick in automatically, the same instinct that years of training had carved into my muscles until it no longer required conscious thought. I registered the angle of his grip, the distribution of his weight, the small shift in his stance as he prepared to demonstrate the hold. I registered, too, the confidence in his posture, the complete absence of caution, because he did not believe he needed any caution at all. "I want you to understand," he said to the class, "that even a light application of pressure here can immobilize a human wrist with almost no effort." He began to apply that pressure, expecting no resistance, expecting the moment to unfold exactly as he had planned it 100 times before with other examples over the years. Instead, I moved. It happened in less time than it takes to describe. I shifted my weight into his grip, rather than away from it, using his own hold as leverage against him, redirecting the pressure he had applied back through his own arm instead of mine. My other hand came up in a controlled motion, guided by years of repetition, until the movement felt less like a choice and more like breathing. I did not strike him. I did not need to strike him. I simply used his own momentum, his own confidence, his own certainty that I could not possibly resist, and turned all of it back against the joint he had underestimated the least, his own elbow. There was a sound in the room that I will never forget, a sharp, sudden crack that cut through the air and silenced every whisper, every murmur, every trace of laughter that had followed me since the moment I arrived at this academy. Instructor Vantis made a short, surprised sound, more shock than anything else, and stumbled back a step, cradling his arm against his chest, his 4 hands trembling slightly as the reality of what had just happened settled over him. The room did not laugh. I stood exactly where I had been standing, my breathing steady, my stance calm, my expression giving away nothing beyond quiet control. I had not moved more than a few inches. I had not raised my voice. I had simply done what years of discipline had prepared me to do the moment someone gave me an opening they did not know they were giving. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Every cadet in that hall stared at me with an expression none of them had worn since I arrived, something between disbelief and a dawning, uncomfortable recalculation. The Austin cadet who had joked about humans falling over now sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. The cadets who had laughed the loudest the day before now looked at me the way people look at something they suddenly realize they have misjudged. Instructor Vantis straightened, still holding his arm, his composure returning slowly despite the obvious pain etched across his face. He looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, somewhere between anger and something else, something closer to reluctant recognition. "You broke my arm," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the confident authority it had carried only moments earlier. I met his gaze evenly, keeping my voice calm, controlled, without a hint of triumph or cruelty. I did not want this to look like revenge. I wanted it to look like exactly what it was, a correction. "You told the class that a human joint fails easily under simple pressure," I said. I only showed everyone that pressure moves in more than one direction. A few cadets in the back row exchanged glances, and I caught the faint beginning of something new in the room, not laughter this time, but a kind of quiet respect that had not existed a few minutes earlier. It was not universal. Some faces still held doubt, some still held the same dismissive certainty they had carried since the semester began. But something had shifted, something subtle and important, and I could feel it settling over the room like a change in air pressure before a storm. Vantis activated a small medical unit on his uniform, and within seconds, a support brace extended from his sleeve, wrapping around his injured arm to stabilize it until he could reach the medical bay. Even through the obvious discomfort, he maintained a measure of dignity, straightening his posture despite the pain, refusing to let the class see him fully unsettled. "This will require review," he said, his tone tight but controlled. "Cadet Carter, you are to report to the administration office following this session." I nodded once, offering no argument, no explanation, no attempt to soften what had happened. I understood the weight of what I had done, understood that snapping the arm of a respected instructor in front of an entire class was not something the academy would simply overlook, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. Vantis turned to address the class, his voice steadier now, though I noticed the faint strain still present beneath his words. "Let this serve as an additional lesson," he said. "Data describes averages. It does not describe every individual, and it certainly does not describe intent, or training, or the will to use both. I underestimated a variable I should not have underestimated. It was not quite an apology, and I had not expected one. But it was an acknowledgement, spoken in front of the same audience that had laughed at me only a day earlier, and that acknowledgement carried its own kind of weight. Class was dismissed early, the room emptying in a slow, unusually quiet procession, cadets glancing toward me as they filed past, none of them quite sure what to say, if anything. A few offered small nods, gestures I recognized from human military culture more than anything I expected from other species. A kind of silent respect passed between people who understood what discipline and control actually looked like when tested under pressure. I remained in the lowered floor of the hall a moment longer, alone, the echo of that single sharp sound still lingering somewhere in my thoughts. I had not wanted to hurt him. I had wanted, more than anything, to prove that the chart glowing red behind him the day before had missed something essential about what it meant to be human, something no scan or measurement could properly capture. Strength, I thought, standing quietly in the empty hall, was not only measured in bone density or muscle mass. It was measured in the space between an assumption and the moment that assumption meets reality. I gathered my composure, straightened my uniform, and made my way toward the administration office, fully aware that whatever happened next would determine far more than just my standing in this class. It would determine whether the academy, and every species within it, was ready to see humanity as something more than a line at the bottom of a chart. I did not yet know how much that walk down the corridor would change everything that followed. The administration office sat at the top level of the academy, behind a set of doors that most cadets only ever saw during orientation. I had visited it once before, on my first day, when a tired but polite Krill administrator handed me my schedule and told me to try not to embarrass my species. I remembered that comment now, with a strange kind of clarity, as I stood outside those same doors, waiting to be called in to explain why I had broken the arm of one of the academy's most respected instructors. I was not alone in the waiting area. 2 other cadets sat across from me, and I recognized one immediately. Threxel, a large Ausen cadet with dark-plated shoulders and a reputation for being one of the strongest fighters in our year. He did not look at me right away, but I could feel the weight of his attention even before he spoke, the same way you can feel the temperature change before a storm arrives. "You broke an instructor's arm," he said finally, his voice low, almost thoughtful, as if he were still working through the idea in his own mind. He tried to demonstrate that humans were too fragile to resist a simple hold, I said, keeping my tone even. I proved otherwise. Threxel studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the way that many Ausan expressions were unreadable to me, their faces built differently from mine, communicating through small shifts I had not yet learned to read fluently. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there before. Some believe you were fortunate, a lucky angle, a moment of surprise that would not repeat itself against a prepared opponent. I did not respond right away, sensing there was more coming, sensing that this conversation was not simply idle curiosity. I do not believe in luck, he continued. I believe in what can be proven, and I do not believe what happened in that hall proves what people are already saying it proves. Before I could answer, the office door opened, and a tall Krill administrator stepped out, calling my name. I rose, offering Threxel a brief nod that he did not return, and followed the administrator inside. The office was quiet, softly lit, with a long curved desk where 3 senior staff members sat waiting. Instructor Vantis was already there, his arm now fully stabilized in a medical brace, sitting slightly apart from the others, with an expression that had settled into something calmer than the shock I had seen in the training hall. I took the seat offered to me, and waited. The discussion that followed lasted nearly an hour. I answered every question directly, without exaggeration or excuse, describing exactly what had happened and why I had responded the way I did. I explained my training background, the years of close combat instruction I had received before ever leaving Earth, the discipline drilled into me that taught me to control a dangerous situation rather than escalate it unnecessarily. I explained that I had not intended to cause serious injury, only to demonstrate that a human body under pressure was not the passive, fragile thing the chart had suggested. The administrators listened carefully, occasionally exchanging quiet words among themselves in a language I did not fully understand. At one point, the senior administrator, an older Threnari woman with silver markings along her jaw, asked Vantis directly whether he believed the incident constituted an unprovoked attack. Vantis was quiet for a long moment before answering, and I watched him carefully, uncertain what he would say. "No," he said finally. "I initiated contact. I demonstrated a hold with the expectation of no resistance. Cadet Carter reacted within the parameters of that contact. The outcome was more severe than I anticipated, but the response was not unprovoked." His words carried real weight in that room, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease slightly, though I did not let it show on my face. Even injured, even embarrassed, in front of an entire class, he had chosen honesty over pride, and I found myself surprised by that, surprised in a way that made me reconsider some of the assumptions I had carried about him. The administrators deliberated further, discussing academy policy, precedent, and the delicate matter of how this incident might be perceived by the wider Concord now that humanity's standing within it remained new and, in some circles, still fragile in a political sense if not a physical one. I sat quietly through most of it, understanding that this conversation was no longer only about me. It was about what humans meant to this institution, and by extension, to the wider galaxy watching our first tentative steps into shared spaces like this one. Eventually, the senior administrator turned to address me directly. "Cadet Carter," she said, "expulsion has been discussed as an option, given the severity of the outcome. However, given the nature of the demonstration and Instructor Vantis's own account, we do not believe expulsion is warranted." I felt a small measure of relief, though I kept my expression steady, waiting for whatever came next, sensing there was more. "However," she continued, "this incident has drawn significant attention within the cadet population. Several senior students have petitioned for a formal resolution, believing that an official demonstration is required to properly assess whether yesterday's outcome reflects genuine skill or an isolated, fortunate circumstance." I understood immediately what she meant, and a moment later, my suspicion was confirmed when she mentioned the name I had already been expecting. "Cadet Threxel has formally requested a sanctioned duel," she said. "Structured combat, under full academy supervision, with proper safety protocols in place." The purpose would be to settle the matter definitively, both for the sake of academy order and, frankly, for the sake of easing tensions among the cadet body. I sat with that information for a moment, turning it over carefully in my mind. Part of me understood the political convenience of such an arrangement. A formal duel would allow the academy to avoid the difficult question of punishing me while still giving the wider student body, many of whom still doubted humanity's place among them, a chance to see the matter resolved in a controlled setting. It was, in its own way, a compromise designed to protect everyone's interests, except perhaps my own. I could refuse, I said carefully, watching the administrator's expressions. You could, the senior administrator agreed. But I suspect you understand as well as I do that refusal would be interpreted by many as confirmation of yesterday's incident being little more than an accident, rather than evidence of legitimate skill. It would also do little to ease the tension currently building among your fellow cadets. I thought about Threxel waiting outside, about the quiet challenge in his voice when he spoke of luck and prepared opponents. I thought about the cadets who had looked at me with new respect after yesterday's incident, respect that could easily fade if I stepped back now, if I allowed this moment to be dismissed as circumstance rather than capability. And I thought, too, about every human who would follow me into this academy in the years ahead, and what kind of foundation I wanted to leave for them. I accept, I said. The administrators exchanged brief glances, and I saw something close to relief pass between them, though whether that relief came from resolving an awkward political situation or from genuine curiosity about how the duel would unfold, I could not say for certain. The duel was scheduled for 1 week later, giving both Threxel and myself time to prepare under proper supervision. Instructor Vantis, despite his injury, requested to oversee my preparation personally, a request the administrators approved without much discussion. I left the office that afternoon with a strange, unsteady feeling settling over me, part determination, part uncertainty, and a growing awareness that the next week would shape far more than just my own reputation within these walls. Outside the office, I found Vantis waiting near the corridor, his arm still secured in its brace, his expression thoughtful rather than resentful. "You could have simply pinned me," he said as I approached. "A controlled hold. A demonstration of resistance without permanent injury. Why did you choose to break the joint entirely?" I considered the question carefully before answering, understanding that my response mattered, both to him and, in some way, to myself. "Because a controlled hold would have proven I could resist," I said. "Breaking the joint proved I understood exactly how much force was required to end the demonstration on my terms, not yours. I did not want anyone in that room mistaking restraint for weakness a second time." Vantis studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, a kind of grudging respect settling into the lines of his scarred face. "You will need more than technique against Threxel," he said finally. "He is larger, faster, and trained specifically for direct confrontation. Precision alone may not be enough." "I understand," I said. "Then we begin training this evening," he said, turning to walk beside me down the corridor despite his injury. "I owe you a proper education in what your species is truly capable of, beyond what any chart could measure. It seems only fair, given the circumstances." I almost smiled at that, though I kept my expression controlled, matching his measured pace as we walked together toward the training wing. Somewhere behind us, word of the sanctioned duel was already spreading through the academy, cadet to cadet, corridor to corridor, until by evening every student on the station would know that in 7 days a human and an Aussen would meet in the arena to settle, once and for all, a question that had never truly needed asking in the first place. That night, alone in my quarters, I sat with my knees drawn to my chest and allowed myself, for the first time since arriving at the academy, a quiet moment of doubt. Threxel was larger than me in every measurable way, stronger according to every chart the academy trusted, faster according to his training records, which I had quietly reviewed before returning to my room. If this came down to raw physical comparison, the numbers would not favor me any more than they had favored me during yesterday's lecture. But numbers, I reminded myself, had never told the whole story. Not about my grandmother, who survived circumstances that should have ended her decades earlier. Not about my father, who returned from deployments that changed him but never broke him. Not about the countless soldiers throughout human history who had faced opponents larger, stronger, and better equipped, and found ways to win anyway, not through matching strength for strength, but through adapting, enduring, and refusing to accept the ending that logic seemed to demand. I thought about the week ahead, about the training sessions with Vantis, about the quiet, complicated respect building between us, despite everything that had happened. I thought about Threxel, waiting somewhere in this same station, likely running through his own preparations, confident in the advantages his body gave him. Let him have his confidence, I thought, finally allowing myself to lie back and close my eyes. Confidence built entirely on physical advantage had a way of becoming its own weakness, a blind spot that someone patient enough could learn to use. I had 7 days to prepare. 7 days to turn doubt into readiness, to sharpen every skill I had carried with me from Earth into something precise enough to overcome every advantage stacked against me. 7 days before I stepped into that arena and answered once and for all whether humanity's place among the stars would be measured by the size of our bodies or the strength of everything that lived inside them. I fell asleep slowly that night, my mind still turning through strategies, my body already anticipating the discipline the coming week would demand. Somewhere above me, the station continued its slow, steady rotation around the blue gas giant, indifferent to the quiet storm building within its walls. A storm that would, in 7 days, finally be given the chance to prove itself. The 7 days passed faster than I expected, each one filled with training sessions that pushed me harder than anything I had experienced since my earliest days of military instruction back on Earth. Instructor Vantis, despite his still healing arm, supervised every session personally, standing at the edge of the training floor and calling out corrections with the same sharp precision he had once used to describe humanity's supposed weaknesses. His approach surprised me. Rather than focusing only on technique, he spent hours studying recordings of Threxel's previous matches, breaking down every pattern, every tendency, every subtle shift in stance that might reveal an opening. He explained that Ausen fighters relied heavily on their initial advantage, using size and strength to end confrontations quickly before an opponent could adapt or recover. He will try to close the distance immediately, Vantis told me during one session, standing beside a projected recording of Threxel in a previous sanctioned match. Ausen physiology favors short, decisive exchanges. He does not want a long fight. He wants this over before your endurance becomes relevant. Then I make sure endurance becomes relevant early, I said. Vantis studied me for a moment, something like approval crossing his scarred features. Precisely, he said. You will not win by matching his strength. You will win by making the fight last long enough that strength stops being the only variable that matters. We trained late into the evenings, working through defensive techniques designed to absorb and redirect force rather than meet it directly, movements that relied on timing and precision instead of raw power. I spent hours practicing footwork on the reinforced training floor, learning to move in ways that conserved energy while forcing an opponent to expend more of their own. Vantis taught me pressure points specific to Ausen physiology, areas where their thick plating grew thinner, weaknesses that a human strike, properly placed, could exploit even against a much larger frame. Word of the upcoming duel had spread throughout the academy, and I began noticing small changes in how other cadets treated me. A few of the human liaison staff stationed at the academy found quiet moments to offer encouragement, standing at the edges of training sessions, nodding silently when I landed a difficult sequence correctly. One of them, a former Earth military instructor named Daniel Pierce, spent an evening walking me through additional grappling techniques he had learned during his own service. techniques designed specifically for smaller fighters facing larger opponents. "You are not the first human to face someone bigger than you," he told me, adjusting my stance during a practice hold. "You will not be the last. Remember that size wins fast fights. It rarely wins long, patient ones." I carried his words with me through the rest of the week, repeating them quietly during moments of doubt, of which there were more than I expected. Despite my training, despite the growing confidence Vantis seemed to have in my ability, I could not fully shake the awareness of exactly how much larger and stronger Threxel truly was. I had watched recordings of his previous matches, watched him end confrontations in seconds against opponents who outweighed most humans by a significant margin. Facing that kind of strength directly would end badly for me, and I understood that clearly enough to build my entire strategy around avoiding exactly that mistake. The morning of the duel arrived with a quiet, heavy stillness settling over the academy. I woke early, long before my scheduled preparation time, and spent nearly an hour simply sitting in my quarters, breathing slowly, allowing my mind to settle into the calm, focused state I had learned to summon before any real confrontation. I thought about my family, about the long line of people before me who had faced impossible odds and found ways through them, not through overwhelming strength, but through patience, precision, and a refusal to accept defeat as inevitable. The arena itself sat at the center of the Academy's largest training wing, a circular space surrounded by tiered seating that could hold the entire cadet population when needed. By the time I arrived, nearly every seat was filled, a sea of different species gathered to witness what the Academy had quietly begun calling the first true test of humanity's place among them. Threxel stood on the opposite side of the arena when I entered, his dark-plated shoulders squared, his expression calm and confident in the way of someone who had never once doubted the outcome of a physical confrontation. He did not look at me with hostility, exactly, but with the same measured curiosity I had noticed during our brief exchange outside the administration office, as though he still genuinely wanted to know whether what happened in that training hall had been skill or simple fortune. The senior administrator, who had overseen my meeting the week before, stepped into the center of the arena to address the gathered crowd, explaining the rules of the sanctioned duel. Both combatants would fight using controlled, non-lethal parameters, with medical staff standing by, and the match ending the moment either fighter submitted, was rendered unable to continue, or a designated period passed without a decisive outcome. It was, in every sense, a formal demonstration rather than true combat, though the intensity radiating from both sides of the arena made it feel like something far more significant. I took my position at the center marker, feeling the weight of hundreds of watching eyes settle over me, the same way they had settled over me during that first lecture, except now the atmosphere carried a different kind of energy, something closer to genuine anticipation than dismissive amusement. Threxel moved to the opposite marker, rolling his shoulders once, settling into a low, powerful stance built for exactly the kind of fast, decisive strike Vantis had warned me to expect. I settled into my own stance, lighter, more mobile, my weight balanced carefully across the balls of my feet, ready to move the moment the signal was given. The administrator raised a hand, held it briefly, then dropped it sharply, signaling the start of the match. Threxel moved immediately, exactly as predicted, closing the distance between us with startling speed for someone his size. I sidestepped at the last possible moment, letting his initial strike pass just wide of my shoulder, using the movement to circle rather than retreat, keeping him turning, keeping him working harder than he had anticipated for an opponent supposedly this much weaker. He recovered quickly, adjusting his angle, driving forward again with a heavy strike aimed at my center mass. This time I could not fully avoid it, and the impact caught my forearm as I raised it defensively, sending a sharp burst of pain through my arm and knocking me back several steps. The crowd reacted audibly, a mixture of gasps and murmurs, and I caught a brief flash of satisfaction crossing Threxel's face, the confirmation he had clearly been expecting from the very beginning. I let that satisfaction remain a moment longer than necessary, allowing my movements to appear slightly slower, slightly more strained than they actually were. A deliberate choice built into the strategy Vantis and I had spent the past week refining. If Threxel believed he had already found my limit, he would grow bolder, less careful, exactly the opening I needed. He pressed forward again, more aggressively this time, confident the fight was nearly finished. I waited until the last possible instant, then shifted my weight low and sideways, letting his forward momentum carry him past me rather than into me, using the same principle that had ended Vantis's demonstration the week before, redirecting force rather than meeting it directly. As he stumbled slightly off balance, I moved quickly, striking precisely at a point along his side where Vantis had taught me the plating grew thinner, a vulnerable seam most opponents never bothered targeting because they assumed, incorrectly, that Ausen defense remained uniform across their entire frame. Threxel let out a sharp, surprised sound, staggering further, his earlier confidence flickering for the first time since the match began. The crowd's reaction shifted instantly, murmurs rising into something louder, more engaged, no longer certain how this confrontation would end. I did not allow myself to celebrate the small victory, understanding clearly that Threxel remained far from finished, that a single successful strike would not be enough against someone with his training and physical advantage. He recovered faster than I expected, turning back toward me with renewed intensity, his earlier caution replaced now with something sharper, more focused, the recognition finally settling in that this fight would not end as quickly or as easily as he had assumed. What followed was a longer, more grueling exchange than either of us had likely anticipated, strikes and counters trading back and forth across the arena floor, each of us testing the other's limits, searching for openings, adjusting strategies in real time. I took several more hits during that stretch, absorbing impacts that left my arms aching and my breath coming harder than I wanted to admit. But I kept moving, kept circling, kept forcing Threxel to chase an opponent who refused to simply stand and absorb his advantage, the way his previous matches had likely trained him to expect. Every minute that passed worked steadily in my favor, exactly as Vantis had predicted, Threxel's initial burst of aggressive energy beginning to show the first signs of strain as the fight extended well beyond the short, decisive time frame his training had prepared him for. Near what I sensed was the fight's true turning point, Threxel lunged forward with a heavy, committed strike, clearly intending to end the match decisively. I recognized the opening the moment his weight shifted forward too far, exactly the kind of overextension Vantis had spent hours training me to watch for. I moved low and fast, catching his extended arm and using his own forward momentum, combined with careful leverage against a joint I had studied extensively over the past week, to bring him down to the arena floor in a controlled but decisive motion. The impact of his fall echoed through the arena, and before he could recover his footing, I secured a controlled hold, one designed not to cause lasting injury, but to clearly and unmistakably demonstrate that I retained full control of the confrontation's outcome. Threxel struggled briefly against the position, but the leverage held, and after a tense, silent moment, he tapped the arena floor twice, the universal signal of submission recognized across every species present. The arena erupted, not with laughter this time, but with something closer to genuine astonishment, applause and murmurs rippling through the tiered seating as the administrator stepped forward to officially declare the match concluded. I released the hold immediately, stepping back to allow Threxel room to rise, extending a hand toward him despite my own exhaustion, a gesture I hoped would communicate respect rather than triumph. He accepted the gesture after a brief hesitation, rising slowly, his earlier confidence replaced now with something more complicated, a mixture of surprise and grudging acknowledgement that reminded me, in some ways, of the expression Vantis had worn following our first encounter. "You did not fight the way I expected," Threxel said quietly, his voice carrying only to me amid the noise still filling the arena. "I fought the way I was trained. I said. Size decides fast fights. It does not decide patient ones. He studied me for a long moment, then offered a slow, deliberate nod, the closest thing to genuine respect I had seen from him since our first tense exchange outside the administration office. Around us, the crowd continued reacting, the atmosphere in that arena shifting into something I had not felt since arriving at this academy, a quiet, growing recognition that perhaps the numbers on that chart had never told the whole story after all. The days following the duel passed differently than any I had experienced since arriving at the academy. Cadets who had once avoided eye contact now nodded politely when passing me in the corridors. Some stopped to ask genuine questions about human training methods, curious in a way that felt respectful rather than dismissive. The change was not universal, and I did not expect it to be. A single duel could shift perception, but it could not erase every deeply held assumption overnight. Still, something fundamental had changed, and I could feel it in the way the academy's atmosphere settled around me now, lighter, more open, less like a space I had to fight simply to occupy. 3 days after the match, I received a message requesting my presence in the medical wing. I assumed it concerned a routine follow-up regarding the bruising along my forearm, still healing from the impacts I had absorbed during the fight. Instead, when I arrived, I found Instructor Vantis waiting for me, seated near the observation window, his arm finally free of its brace, flexing his fingers slowly as though testing the returned strength. "I did not expect to see you here," I said, taking the seat across from him. "I requested this meeting," he said. "I wanted to speak with you somewhere quieter than the training hall." I waited, uncertain what direction the conversation would take, watching as he continued flexing his healing arm with quiet, thoughtful movements. "I have reviewed the recordings of your match several times," he said finally. "I have also reviewed my own lecture from the day before your demonstration. I find myself needing to reconsider several conclusions I once held with great confidence." I said nothing, allowing him space to continue, sensing this admission was not easy for someone with his reputation and experience. "The chart I presented that day was not incorrect," he continued. "Your species does possess less physical durability than most others represented in this academy. That much remains true according to every measurable standard we currently use." I nodded slowly, waiting for the rest. "But durability," he said, choosing his words carefully, "is apparently not the only variable that determines outcome. I measured bone density and healing rates. I did not measure whatever it is that allowed you to absorb repeated strikes from an opponent nearly twice your size and continue adjusting your strategy rather than simply enduring until defeat became inevitable. Discipline," I offered quietly. "Training. A refusal to accept that losing is decided before the fight actually ends." Vantis studied me for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing his scarred features. "Perhaps our current measurements are simply incomplete," he said. "Perhaps resilience exists in forms we have not yet learned to properly chart." I found myself smiling slightly at that, the first genuine smile I had allowed myself in what felt like a very long time. "I have submitted a formal request to Academy leadership," Vantis continued, "to revise our current curriculum regarding species durability assessments. I believe our current models require additional variables, particularly regarding psychological endurance and adaptive strategy, areas your species appears to compensate for what it lacks in raw physical resilience." "That means more to me than you probably realize," I said honestly. He inclined his head slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement. "It is the least I can offer, given that my own arm required significant time to heal thanks to the lesson you provided." I laughed quietly at that, and after a brief pause, Vantis allowed himself a small, rare smile of his own, the scars along his face shifting into an expression I had not seen from him before, something almost warm despite his usually stern demeanor. Word of the revised curriculum spread through the academy over the following weeks, and I noticed subtle changes beginning to take shape in how instructors approached lessons involving comparative species analysis. The old chart, the one that had once placed humanity firmly at the bottom without qualification, was quietly updated to include additional context, acknowledging that raw physical statistics told only part of a much larger story. Threxel and I crossed paths several more times in the weeks following our duel, and though our relationship never became close in any traditional sense, a quiet mutual respect settled between us, the kind built not on friendship but on shared understanding, earned through genuine testing. He occasionally sought me out during shared training sessions, asking questions about human tactics, genuinely curious now rather than skeptical, and I found myself equally curious about Asin combat traditions, exchanging knowledge in a way that felt far more valuable than the tension that had defined our earlier encounters. Near the end of that semester, Academy leadership announced an expansion of the Human Cadet program, citing renewed confidence in humanity's capability to meet the rigorous standards expected of every species within the Concord. 5 new human cadets were scheduled to arrive at the beginning of the following term, a number that felt small in the wider scope of the Academy's total population, but significant to me personally, knowing I would no longer be the only human walking these corridors. I thought often, during those final weeks, about the moment that had started everything, that single sharp sound echoing through a training hall that had once treated my presence as little more than a curious inconvenience. I had not set out that day to prove anything beyond a simple, personal refusal to let an incomplete chart define how an entire room understood my species. Yet somehow, that single moment had rippled outward, reshaping not only how others saw humanity, but how the Academy itself measured strength altogether. On my final evening before the semester's end, I stood alone near the observation deck, overlooking the blue gas giant the Academy orbited, watching the slow, steady rotation of stars beyond the reinforced glass. I thought about my grandmother, about my father, about every human before me who had faced circumstances that logic suggested should have ended in defeat, and who had found ways through anyway, not because they were the strongest in the room, but because they refused to accept the room's assumptions as the final word. Humanity was not the most durable species among the stars. We did not possess thick plating, natural weapons, or rapid healing. Vantis's original chart had not lied about any of that. But charts, I had come to understand, could only ever measure what could be measured. They could not measure the quiet, stubborn refusal that lived somewhere deeper than bone and tissue, the part of us that kept moving long after logic suggested we should have already stopped. Behind me, I heard familiar footsteps approaching, and turned to find Vantis joining me at the observation deck, his expression calm, contemplative, matching the quiet mood of the evening around us. "New cadets arrive in 3 weeks," he said, standing beside me at the window. "I know," I said. "I plan to be there when they do." He nodded slowly, understanding immediately what I meant without needing further explanation. "They will not need to prove what you have already proven," he said, "but I suspect they will find their own moments regardless. That seems to be a particular talent among your species." I smiled, watching the slow drift of stars beyond the glass, thinking about everything the past few months had taught me, about assumptions and their limits, about resilience measured in ways no chart could properly capture. "We tend to find ways forward," I said quietly, "even when the numbers suggest otherwise." Vantis said nothing further, simply standing beside me in comfortable silence as the station continued its slow, steady rotation around the gas giant below, carrying both of us, and everyone else aboard, steadily forward into whatever came next. Somewhere within these walls, 5 new humans were preparing to make their own journey toward this academy, unaware of the quiet foundation already waiting for them, built not from broken bones or dramatic demonstrations, but from a simple, stubborn truth that had finally found its place among the stars. We were never the strongest. We had simply never learned how to stop.